Hello and welcome to my studio. In this video I'm going to show you how I made this image. This picture shows the amount of detail and structure available in everyday objects. In this video I'll show you all the lighting, photographic and post-processing techniques I use to make it. So let me show you what I've got set up so far. Here I have a table, and on the table I've got this retort stand. Now I'm going to be using this to hold the subject. I like to use these because it gives you an awful lot of manoeuvrability and you can easily get your subject into exactly the correct position. So for the subject I'm using these peas in a pod, or Monge 2. And what I've done with this particular one is I've put a pin in the end of it here. I can use that pin to then clamp it in position. So what I can do is just pop that in the jaws of this holder here, and there. Now I can move this around and maneuver it, and it becomes very easy to get it in exactly the correct position. So then coming forward, I have my camera on this tripod. Now I'm using a tripod which has a geared center column. I find this very useful for doing this sort of close-up work. It will give you a lot of adjustment of exactly where you're going to put the camera. On the front of the camera I have this 24-70 zoom lens. I'm going to start off at the 70 end, but that will change as we carry on. On the top of the camera I have a flash sync trigger. This is also capable of controlling the energy in the flash. The camera itself is tethered into Capture One software. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is just to make sure that I don't get any unwanted contamination from the house lights. So what I'm going to do is just capture a frame with no flash, just at arbitrary settings, just to see what we get. And there we are. We're getting a bit of an image here, and if we have a look at what the camera is set to, we have a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. Now that's probably a little low, and the flash sync speed for that camera is 1/250th of a second. So I can just adjust that, like so. The ISO is set to a base of 100 ISO, and I'm using an aperture of f4. So with these new settings, I'll just capture another image to see what contamination I'm getting now. There we are, that's quite a lot better. You're still getting a little bit of an image, but nothing too serious. And almost certainly I will not be using f4 as my finished aperture. So at a higher aperture, this part of the image will disappear anyway. So with that experiment out of the way, it's time to set a flash. Here we are. This is the studio flash that I'm going to use on this occasion. This is a Profoto D2. It has an energy of 1000 joules, so it is quite powerful. However, as I show later on in the video, you don't actually need anything like that sort of power. If you just use the correct techniques for the subject and the focal length of the lens, bizarrely, you can actually get away with an awful lot less energy in the flash. And to do this sort of thing, you can easily do this with a standard speedlight flash gun. Okay, so the next thing to do would be just to make sure that everything is lined up. The whole of this technique relies on the object, the subject, being in such a position as to obscure the flash itself. So this needs to be precisely aligned with the flash and the correct distance from the lens so that it's big enough in the frame so that it covers the flash. Now in order to show that, what I'm going to do is just switch over to live view on the tethering so that you can see the image as I set it up. In order to get this to work, I'm just going to temporarily increase the ISO to 1600 or thereabouts, just so that we get an image. Okay, so we can see it's a little bit fuzzy, and I think it's a bit small in the frame as well. So just to focus that to start with, there we are, it's just on the edge of what I can actually focus with that lens. And you should be able to see that just in the background there, that is the flash head. So that just needs moving over ever so slightly to one side. Something like that. Okay, so with that adjusted, I'll take this back down to 100 and we'll just dispense with the live view. And we'll just take an image with the flash on an arbitrary energy level. There we go, so that's our first capture, and it's starting to show a bit of promise, but there are a few things wrong with it. The first is that the subject itself isn't big enough in the frame to cover the flash, which you can see around the edges here, which ruins the whole effect really. So there's a couple of things that you can do to improve that situation. One would be to move the flash further away, which will make it smaller relative to the subject. So I'm going to do that to start with. So I'll just move this further away, like so. Obviously I'm going to need to realign everything now I've moved the flash head. The other thing would be to see if I can get the subject closer to the lens to make it bigger in the frame. Now as I am at the moment, this is right on the edge of where this lens will focus. So in order to make it focus closer, what I'm going to do is add an extension tube just in the back here, like that. You should be able to see this is the short extension tube. It's only 12 millimeters, but it will make a big difference to the way that this lens will focus now. So I'll just need to recompose the image. Just looking through the viewfinder, I'll move the camera in like so. There we are. So with those two things done, we'll take another test. Okay, so that's starting to get there. You can see the flash fairly obviously. So what I'm going to do is just realign this. So once again, I'm just going to go to live view with an ISO of 1600, and just so I can see the flash at the back, I'm just going to turn the modeling light on. There we go. So now what I'm going to do is just wind the camera up a little, and this is where having a center column is very, very handy. So I'll turn the modeling light off and take another image. Yeah, that's better. But the depth of field is starting to have an effect now, and we can see at this end it's out of focus. It's in focus in the middle, and at this end it's also out of focus. So what I'm going to do is increase the aperture from f4 to f8, which is 2 stops. So I'll need to add 2 stops of energy to the flash. And we'll take that again. Yes, that's starting to get there. I think it just needs to be increased by a further stop, just to give it a bit more bite. Let's find that. There we are, that's betting there. And yet it's still just starting to go out of focus on the ends. So I just need to take that up by another 2 stops to f16. So I'll need to add another 2 stops of energy. like that, and we'll give that a go. Yep, and that's giving us a fairly good result. However, there are a few problems with this. It is giving us a reasonable result, but it's using an awful lot of space. There's all this space at the back here to get the flash small enough in the frame relative to the subject. And all that space is using up energy from the flash. I mentioned earlier this is a 1000 joule unit. This is on full energy now. That is an awful lot of light. Now all this is caused because of the viewpoint that we are using with this lens set to 70mm. And all of those problems that I've just mentioned can be made to disappear just by changing the focal length of this lens. Let me show you what I mean. If I take this from 70 and put it at an arbitrary 40 something, like so, what that will do is allow me to get the lens closer to the subject. That will change the viewpoint. It doesn't change the perspective, but it will change the viewpoint. Therefore, I won't need to have the flash as far away to have it covered in the frame by the subject. Now got the lens set to 40mm, and what I'm going to do is just realign everything. So just looking through the viewfinder, I can move the camera in, and move the subject closer to the camera. Now because of the extension tubes, I will still be able to focus. So there we go. That's looking a little better. I can now move the flash closer in. Something like that. Just try and keep it lined up. Go. Now I'll just give that a test with the energy level set as it was. And now you can clearly see that it is way overexposed. So with this in this position that I've got now, one, I don't need as much space because this is a lot closer. This is a bit closer to the lens, so all that's working well for me. And two, I don't need anything like the energy that I was using before. So I'm going to take 4 stops off this flash. There we go. And we'll just try that again. There we are, that's much better. Okay, so remember then, with this in this new position, I've been able to reduce the energy in the flash at the back from its full power of 1000 joules to something like 75 joules, which is the equivalent of a small flash gun, a small speed light. So you can quite happily do this at this distance with a small speed light. And the technique to all that is to use a wider angle on the lens, which will allow you to have a change in viewpoint. And because of that change in viewpoint, I can bring the subject closer to the lens, which means that I can also bring the light source much closer to the subject, and yet it will still obscure it. It'll still be big enough in the frame so that you can't actually see the light. Okay, so with all that lot set, having looked at the image, you can see that in the top here, this part is quite dark. Now it might be a reasonable idea just to fill that in a bit. So what I'm going to do, just using this piece of card, again just an offcut of mount board, I'm just going to recycle some of that light back onto the subject again. So I'm just going to place this in here. I'll place it quite close to start with, and we'll just take an image. There we are, and you can see from that that it's filled it in, but it's probably filled it in a bit too much. So in order to reduce the amount of light I'm getting back off this card, I'm just going to bring it right back to the camera. So about there, and take that again. There we are, that's reduced it. I'll look at the one that I had before. You've got all this fill in, and now you've just got a little bit of fill in along the top. And I think that's much better than the version that we had where it's all black along the top. Okay, so with that now captured, it just remains to go into Photoshop and do the post-production. So this is the file opened up in Photoshop. And the first thing I'm going to do is just make a duplicate of this layer. Therefore I can play with the duplicate and I have always got the original to go back to. So there we go. So now I have the background copy here. And this is the layer that I'm going to adjust and edit. So the first thing I want to do is just assess just how black this background is. So I'm just going to bring up the info window. So just go to Window, click on Info, and that just brings up this panel here. So I'll just move that to a reasonable place. And you can see in the numbers where it says RGB that if I run round the outside of this subject, they're not actually 0, so it's not actually black. It's very close, but it's not quite there. So I'm just going to make an adjustment. So I'll go to Image, Adjustments, and come down to Levels. And what I'm going to do is set a new black point. And I can do that by clicking on this little eyedropper tool here, which is the black point eyedropper. So if I just put that somewhere close to the subject and just click on that, it will make a slight change. There we go. Now in order to see what it's doing, if I hold down the Alt key on the keyboard, that will bring up this mask. And you can then see the areas that it's affecting. So if I just click in here, for instance, you can see how I'm changing the black point. There we go. Okay, so apart from this tiny little piece down at the very, very bottom, everywhere else is now a true black. So with that exercise done, I can click on OK. I'll just move the info panel out of the way, pop it up here with the rest of them. There we are. Now, in order to address all the other little bits and the pin which is holding up the subject, what I'm going to do is just add a new layer. So I'll go down to here where the Create New Layer icon is, and making sure that black and white is selected and black is the foreground colour. I'm just going to pick a paintbrush. Now I'm going to make this quite hard, and we'll leave it at that sort of size to start with, and basically just make a mask over the top. There we are. So I'll just zoom in a bit so we can see what we're doing, like that. Now I'm just going to mask that off, make the brush a bit smaller and a little harder. There we are. And you can also see at this magnification that you've got quite a few little aberrations around the outside. So I'm just going to use the same brush just to clear those up a little. Like this. It just cleans up the image overall. And I'll just work my way along, see if there's any others that require it. There's a few at the top here. This is usually just caused by dust being on the outside of the subject. There we are, and there's just a bit of aberration at this end. So I'll just zoom out again. And I'll just clean up the rest of this image just by using a much bigger brush. Like that. Just get rid of all the dust spots from the air. There. Okay. So with that all now complete, it just remains to pick a crop. And I can use the crop tool to also just straighten up the image slightly. So I'm going to pick a ratio of 16:9. I use this because it fits the videos, but you can pick something which suits your subject. We'll just square that up a little, and I'm going to center it in the frame. I might actually make that a little bigger. Like that. Just click on OK. And now just going back down to my background copy, I can just fill these edges in, again with the paintbrush, with black. Just pop on there. Like that. So that is how I've made this subject appear translucent. And you can see all the structure within the pea pod here and the peas inside. I think it does look quite nice and quite striking on a pure black background. Okay, so that just shows what you can do with mundane everyday objects and a little bit of technique. I hope you've enjoyed watching how I did that, and if you like watching these things, just click on the other images as they appear and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you very much for watching.